Sunday Papers on Off the Ball.
All right, good morning. You're very welcome along to this week's Sunday Paper Review. Neil Treacy with you this afternoon. The first Sunday Paper Review as well of the new year, 2021. And we will start by running through the back pages. The Sunday Independent lead with a picture of Ulster's Ethan McElroy scoring during Ulster's win against Munster at Kingspan Stadium last night. And the headline reads, Northern Lights dazzle Ulster bag 10th Pro 14 victory on the trot as second string Munster dig deep for bonus point. So that is Ulster going 10 points clear of their conference ahead of Leinster in the Pro 14. Leinster losing as well to Connacht last night. So it sets things up brilliantly for Ulster's meeting with Leinster this coming weekend. Also then on the side, attacking intent is a delight for Mourinho. That's after Jose Mourinho's side beat Leeds 3-0 in the Premier League yesterday. On the back page of the Sunday Times this morning, out in the cold, West Brom thrashed again as revitalised Arsenal make it 3 wins in a row. Arsenal's Kieran Tierney celebrating the opening goal of that game, an absolute screamer as well, coming in from the left and firing a shot right-footed up into the far top corner. And then also on the bottom page as well, which is something we'll probably speak about in the next few minutes as well, Lions to decide on tour within weeks. So this is news that the organisers of the British and Irish Lions tour to South Africa have said they will try and make a decision in the next few weeks about whether or not this tour is going to go ahead or if it has to be postponed by a year. That is because of further COVID outbreaks in South Africa and just real uncertainty over whether this can go ahead. And also on the side as well, Ashley seals 5-year sponsorship deal with Cork. That's Mike Ashley's Sports Direct brand, the sports retailer, which is owned by Ashley. They are going to be the new sponsors of the Cork GA teams, a new deal understood to be worth €2 million over 5 years. So that is Mike Ashley getting involved with the Cork GA teams. On the back page of the Mail, COVID chaos. Giovanni Lo Celso, Eric Lamela and West Ham's Manuel Lanzini and Sergio Reguilon of Spurs as well also. After the 4 of them are facing disciplinary action from their clubs over breaking COVID protocols over Christmas with a large family and friends gathering over the Christmas period as well. Reguilon actually played yesterday while the club spoke out against the rest of those players as well. And also on the bottom, an article here by John Fallon. FAI reaction inflamed Wembley-gate, admits Barrett. This is Roy Barrett saying that the Wembley-gate incident with Stephen Kenny was a shame, but that the FAI's reaction compounded the reaction as well for the Republic of Ireland manager. On the back page of the Irish Sun this morning, someone's been telling me porkies after pig gift to Reguilon Jose Rap as Home Alone star parties. The references to pig here being that Jose Mourinho had given Reguilon a gift of a pig to keep him company over Christmas. Well, not so much keep him company, but keep him fed over Christmas, because Reguilon was meant to be spending the Christmas period alone, but as we saw, spent it with quite a lot of his teammates, friends and families as well. Botman and Robin is the headline on the back page of the Sunday World. Manchester United could steal superhero defender from under the noses of arch enemies Pool. They are saying, this is Ken Lawrence writing, that Manchester United could be set to nick Lille centre-back Sven Botman from under the nose of Liverpool in this January transfer window. And also on the bottom, is he on the verge of an early comeback? Vans on mend. New year good news for Pool. Frank de Boer, the Netherlands manager, says he's hoping to have Virgil van Dijk back in his team for this summer's European Championships and hopes he could play again for Liverpool this season. That would seem unlikely, I would say, given the nature of Van Dijk's ACL injury. And then finally, more on the Spurs players and Manuel Lanzini of West Ham, who were pictured partying together over Christmas. COVID-idiots. Jose disappointed as Spurs 3 break Tier 4 rules over festive period. Now Crystal Palace, West Ham and Fulham also investigate breaches by their players. So, first Sunday paper review of 2021. I'm delighted to welcome the Irish Independent's chief sports writer for the Irish Independent, Vincent Hogan, to the Sunday paper review this morning, and also as well Mick O'Keefe, CEO of Teneo Ireland. Afternoon, guys, and Happy New Year to you both.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Neil.
Hope you had a very nice and safe Christmas, unlike those Spurs and West Ham players.
Well, planning a very safe and nice January, I'll put it to you like that, Neil.
Well, I've 3 boys under 6 at home, Neil, so there wasn't too much partying in our house, put it that way.
Yeah, we're in for another little while of this, yes. Vincent, even I was thinking it's good to have you on Skype. The last time we tried to do this, it was early on in the lockdown period. It was one of our first weeks doing our Sunday paper reviews over Skype, and like there were hiccups given that it was in the early stages of all this. But it's good to see a beautiful, clear camera. You sound absolutely perfect.
I'm absolutely chuffed that the only problems this morning were with Mick's side, because I'm a complete Luddite, Neil, and I almost had a knot in my stomach that I'd make another fool of myself with Skype this morning, because I don't tend to use it, to be honest, and I'm very old-fashioned. I can never understand why people use social media and all the rest when they can just pick up the phone, but maybe that's my generation.
Very good. And Mick, as Vincent referenced, we have you here eventually.
Yeah, well, there was a few last-minute wobbles. I'm kind of a veteran of the Teams and the Zoom at this stage, but yeah, I rediscovered that the internet needed to be rebooted. It was as basic as that. So hopefully it's not a sign of things to come for 2021.
Yeah, and I think we might actually just start on maybe a bit more upbeat note, because there are, as we mentioned, it's the first Sunday paper review of 2021, so it's the first set of Sunday papers of the new year, and there's a lot in the Sunday papers of, things we're looking forward to seeing over the next year or so, a kind of preview of the 12 months ahead. And while there are obviously challenges as well with getting people back into grounds and even just having competitions run off smoothly, there's a nice little bit of reassurance, or almost just a bit of comfort in reading about all the different things that we could possibly look forward to over the next 12 months, whether it's European Championships, whether it's Olympic Games or Lions Tours, depending on what sport you follow. There is, I suppose, a bit of optimism there that even if there aren't people at it, there's a good chance we're going to have some of these things.
Yeah, I suppose this time of the year, it is that time of the year where you look forward to the sporting, season, and things like just like annual challenge matches, Dublin Blue Stars, there's horse racing, and then you get into Alliance Leagues and Cheltenhams. There's kind of a flow to the year. Like, obviously that flow has been kind of thrown up in the air, and we're restarting again. But you do look at the papers today, and you do get a bit of excitement despite the kind of big black cloud that hangs over us. And in all the papers today, there's a look ahead at 2021. And I think if 2021 and the sporting season was to go ahead, and we were to get some fans back in stadia at some stage, maybe in the second half of the year, like, we're actually getting a year and a half of bumper sport in one. And like, you look at Roy Curtis, I think the back of the Sunday Indo as well, the Sunday Times, and they all do it slightly differently in terms of, key dates to watch out for, or things and themes to watch out for. But like, when you consider there's an Olympic year, a Paralympic year, Euro 2020, 21 now, obviously, a Lions Tour, hopefully, a Ryder Cup, like all the stuff that you kind of almost forgotten about that was going to happen in this year. Wouldn't it be fabulous if, all this was to happen and we were to get this virus under control, and we could get people back into stadia? I suppose that is tinged with a kind of the big question mark, and the Lions Tour obviously been won very early on. And I suppose looking at it from where we're looking at it now, the big test, I think, for sport this year is, do we have an Olympics? What does that look like? Do we have a Euros? What does that look like? But like, what an amazing year it could be in sport. If you look at the Euros, Sunday Times, England v Scotland, you got the British-Irish Lions, and this is on top of everything else. This is on top of a very unique GA season that's going to happen in early half of 2021. The quickest turnaround that a defending champions will have to go at it again. But I think, just to conclude on that, we spoke, I think, last March, April, and the question mark was, would we have any GA season? Would we have any Six Nations? And I think credit to all the players and people involved, and the organisers and the administrators. I don't think anybody should take for granted how incredibly positive it was that these things actually happened. And you'd like to think, with the knowledge of what has come in the last 9 months, that we will see all these things happen in 2021. And wouldn't it be fabulous for everybody?
And Vincent, actually, just while Mick was speaking there, the thought popped into my head that every January, yourselves and the Irish Independent, I know the Irish Times as well would have a big one at some point during the month. The big Irish Independent kind of sports pull-out calendar would often appear in the paper. We'd get sent out loads of them, and there'd always be either the Independent or the Irish Times one would be up on the wall outside here, giving you all the key dates and stuff ahead. Out of curiosity, are you even putting one together, given the complete uncertainty over when certain things are going to be happening?
I'm actually not sure, Neil. I do think there's a sense of just this major asterisk is still there under so much, and a lot of stuff in the papers today about the Lions tour, for example. There's going to be a decision made on the Lions tour next month, and it's interesting that looking at Stephen Jones in the Sunday Times compared to Brendan Fanning in the Sunday Independent, Stephen Jones is more or less saying that it's just untenable to have a Lions tour to South Africa without crowds, because they're expecting, in a normal circumstances, 35,000 people to travel to South Africa. And from the point of view of the host nation, the crowds are absolutely essential. And Stephen Jones is making the point that it's actually almost pointless having the tour behind closed doors, which is something Brendan Fanning seems to think is possible. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, largely because of there's a slowness, to put it mildly, in terms of the rollout of vaccinations in South Africa. A suggestion it may even be the second half of the year before that happens, in which case obviously 35,000 people flying in there is not feasible. But Stephen Jones makes a very interesting suggestion, because the Six Nations is coming now in literally a matter of weeks away, but it's going to have to be without crowds. And he thinks that if the Lions tour has to be put off by a year, he suggests that the home nations, because they're so desperate to get crowds back into the stadia, that they may like the idea of the Six Nations taking that slot in the summer. So I just think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Like the Olympics, as far as we know, are going ahead in July, but a big upsurge in cases in Tokyo. Now, Tokyo is such a vast place. When you see a figure of 1,000 positives, it seems pretty stark. But I think there's something like 67 million people live in Tokyo. So it's very hard to know. I at this remove, I can't even see crowds at the Olympics. I can see an Olympics behind closed doors, but that's it. And then you have the GA inter-county season flipping so quickly and so uniquely that we're going to be straight into it in February. But again, it looks like it's going to have to be without crowds. And from the GA's point of view, that's a huge issue too, that they're going to have a second championship without crowds.
Mm-hmm. Out of curiosity, what would be the one thing you would pencil in as the one you're most looking forward to in 2021? All things going ahead, if we could kind of half presume for a second.
It would have to be Padraig Harrington as captain of the European team in Whistling Straits in September. He's just one of the most intriguing, unorthodox, eccentric, brilliant people that I've ever encountered in sport. And I think he'd be so creative and innovative and confident in his leadership of the European team against an American team with 12 of the top 20 players in the world. Europe, clearly outsiders to go and win it this time, but I'm just so looking forward to watching Harrington, his unique take on leadership and how he would go about it. Just one of the most captivating people in sport.
What is it about the captaincy of the Ryder Cup? Because I know there are a lot of Ryder Cup skeptics out there who'd say, well, is the captain essentially just kind of picking a team and laying out, you're going to, I'll pick my best player in this match, and this match. You've obviously covered Ryder Cups. What do you see when you've seen great Ryder Cup captains down the years?
Well, I'm one of the skeptics, Neil.
Oh, okay.
I see a lot of mythologizing of the role of the captain, and making the distinction between foursomes and four balls and chemistry in the team room. And I just happen to believe it can't be that difficult to put compatible people together on the golf course, because starting out, they're going to be world-class golfers. But I'm just, why I'm so intrigued by Harrington is just the way he communicates what he's doing. I just think he's a very innovative, different, deeper thinking type of person. And it's more how he will deal with the media, I suppose, from my point of view, and particularly the American media, which can be very kind of adversarial sometimes in their coverage of it. and will be looking for holes in his leadership. And I think Harrington, it's just his personality, Neil. I don't believe in this thing of, oh, this captain was the difference. I think the players make the difference, and it's the important thing for the captain is not to get in the way.
Mick, are you a Ryder Cup captaincy believer?
I'm less of a skeptic than Vincent, maybe, but I think, look, you have to give some element of credence to bringing people together, creating a team culture, particularly in a sport where most of these people would have played for themselves as opposed to in a team structure, albeit some of the amateurs and the Irish guys would have played in team formats. And I did find it interesting, and I know it's been peddled out a good bit, but how they kind of pick their team pairings at the start, but then they will use the data to judge how fellas are performing, particularly the last 6 or 7 holes of the 18 they might have played that day, and to change things up. I think is an interesting skill, and it is something that I would give a bit of credit to. I do think it's probably the cult of the captain is probably slightly overplayed when it comes to the Ryder Cup, because you do have, I think it probably comes down to your big 4 or 5 personalities in each camp. Are they team players? Are they the kind of people that are, doing the team thing and bringing people with them? You've seen, some of the, the McIlroys, some of these guys, when they really hit form and how it lifts other people on the team, and some guys who are probably mediocre enough in terms of, world standings and that, who become Ryder Cup players and really embrace the tension and embrace the whole thing. So, yeah, I would give a bit of credibility to the captain, but I think it's one of a number of factors. I think the leadership team, on a better way of saying it, of the senior golfers on the team as well has a massive impact too.
And before we move on from this, Mick, what's your go-to event this year, all things going to plan?
I'd have to say the Olympics. Look, I think could be an incredible year. But even like Shane Lowry playing in the Olympics, and we're on the subject of golf, I went to Tokyo for the Rugby World Cup, and looking back in hindsight, I have absolutely no regrets about going, because after being locked down for 9 months, I don't look back with any tinge of regret about going there. But what I found very interesting about Tokyo was, apart from the fact that it's a fascinating, huge, hulking city, is everywhere the place was kind of branded for Tokyo 2020. The World Cup was kind of like, it was there, and you could kind of get a sense there was a competition on, but it's such a big place. But it was all about the Olympics, and Japan is an Olympic country, Tokyo's an Olympic city. The Olympics is amazing. I think we have a good few prospects going out to it. The Paralympics as well, obviously. I think we'll probably end up with an Olympics without crowds, which would be really disappointing. But I think, like everything we've seen this year, sport without the fans isn't as good as sport with fans. It's not the same. It's not the shared experience, but it's better than nothing. I think the Olympics could be fascinating. And if anybody can pull it off, the Japanese can. And anybody who's been to Tokyo will tell you it's one of the cleanest places. They'll be hyper organised. They really want to get this. It's kind of become a kind of a cause célèbre for the government as well to make this happen. So I'd love to see an Olympics happen. And that would be my kind of highlight. I think the Euros as well. It's a pity we didn't qualify, obviously. It'd be interesting to see what format that takes. But I think if I've had to nail myself to one thing, I would say the Olympics and Paralympics. I'd be really looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm. All right. We'll... Oh, there was a bit of feedback there. We'll fire into some of the content around the rest of the papers then as well. One thing both of you guys mentioned to me this morning is the back page of the Sunday Times. David Walsh writing about Lisa Olsen, a writer for the Boston Herald back in the early 1990s, and probably tying it in to something that made the headlines this week involving Leeds and Karen Carney. So this is the kind of, I suppose, the story from this week was that Karen Carney was doing analysis for Amazon Prime this week in their Premier League coverage, and made a comment about Leeds and how they might have been relieved at lockdown arriving when it did last year, that they might have run out of steam given they kind of had in previous seasons. And on the back of Leeds' big win during the week, they kind of retweeted that comment. I can't even remember exactly the words they used, just kind of sarcastically dismissing it, resulting in quite a large pile-on. And despite a huge number of people complaining to them about doing so and pretty much making it an open forum for people to attack a female sports journal or a female sports analyst, that, you know, they stood their ground on this and kind of incited the mob almost. But David Walsh is writing about something, I suppose, not similar, but it's actually something I was reading about even myself just yesterday. I'm reading that Jeff Benedict book on the New England Patriots, The Dynasty, and it's the story of Lisa Olsen, as I said, from the Boston Herald, who, I'll just read this extract here. Olsen found Hurst and positioned herself so that she was in the locker room interviewing Maurice Hurst. She found herself in the locker room and positioned herself so that she had her back to the entrance of the shower room. Soon after starting, she could sense some of the players turning their attention towards her. It wasn't like she was trespassing. 12 years earlier, a US federal court had established the right of female journalists to work in locker rooms. It was the tight end Zeke Mowat who approached her first. He was naked. "What do you want? Do you want to take a bite out of this?" he said, angling his genitals close to her. She deliberately kept her gaze on Hurst while another player shouted, "Make her look, make her look." So she reported this afterwards to her paper, and essentially the owner of the New England Patriots at the time, Victor Kayam, he said, "Your paper's asking for trouble sending a female reporter. Why not stand in front of her if she's an intruder?" A week later, Kayam described Olsen as a classic bitch. No wonder the players don't like her. And essentially it just ignited a mob as well. So many people, so many fans around the various Boston sports as well, pretty much made her a pariah. And in the end, she left Boston. She left the sports beat first in Boston and then left the country entirely, moving to Australia to work for the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald. Guys, it's like, thankfully it's probably a story we don't see much of anymore. I would say the Karen Carney situation is, I suppose, a tiny fraction of that vitriol of, you know, pouring out against her. But it is in the same kind of bracket of opening a forum for people to pile on.
Yeah, I think the inevitability of the pile-on, Neil, is the problem you'd have with what Leeds did. What they tweeted, if it was in response to a male pundit, it wouldn't have got a second comment. But the point is, it was in response to a female pundit. And I think everyone has a responsibility to understand the inevitability of the lowest common denominator will just happily pile into something like that. And, you know, they could legitimately have questioned what Karen Carney said, which was that the COVID lockdown essentially gave them 3 months grace. She was saying that they had a habit, which they did, of running out of steam because of their high energy thing. Leeds were saying, I think they won their previous 5 games on the trot. So there was no real evidence that that was going to happen this time. But it was still a legitimate comment to make by her. And she's an astute pundit, and she's made, you know, I've seen her a few times, and she's very interesting. It's important to say it's not really comparable to the Lisa Olsen one. I wasn't aware of the Lisa Olsen one. The Lisa Olsen one is utterly shocking in what she had to put up with it. But it's 1990. And I think back now, as a journalist, I've been around a long time. I was with the Irish Press in the 1980s, and Yvonne Judge came in and worked for the sports department. With the Independent, Cliona Foley, with the Irish Times. Then you had Mary Hannigan. And I have so much respect for those women and getting involved in an environment that was so male-dominated. And I can only imagine, and it's only in hindsight that I think about it, how difficult it must have been for them, because, you know, there was a real kind of smug, you know, there was this kind of sitting in press boxes and little smart aleck comments being made, and you think back on it, and the cowardly thing was just to kind of shrug your shoulders. And I mean, it wouldn't happen now, and it couldn't happen now, and rightly so. But back then, I think they probably had to put up with a lot of innuendo and smart comments that really were unacceptable. And this piece by David, it shines a light on the most extreme form of it, which is the Lisa Olsen one, in which she was subjected to that. The absolutely disgraceful response of the owners of the New England Patriots, and just the level of irresponsibility shown on so many sides towards this woman. The Karen the Karen Carney one is very different, but only in the sense that it's not, it didn't openly abuse her, but it surely, that tweet by Leeds, they would have to have been pretty stupid not to understand what the reaction would have been. And as I say, from the lowest common denominator, and they should have been more responsible than they were, in my view.
Yeah, I think just to pick that up, I didn't know this story either until I read it today, and it's a really, really good piece. I think there's a few things to this. First of all, I think she's a very good pundit. I think she may have just articulated it herself slightly clumsily, which every analyst does. But how irresponsible I think of Leeds to have put that out as bait, I think, on an official Twitter account. And the pile-on that happened afterwards, for me, is just representation of how toxic social media has become. And it wasn't just people bashing a pundit, which, you know, if you're a pundit, you expect people to pick you up when they disagree with you, and people get offended when you criticise their own team. But, like, it was extremely crude and sexist, the comments that came afterwards. I think Leeds were really, really irresponsible. I think this pile-on culture is horrendous that we have in social media now, where people are getting, you know, really aggressive, kind of bitter kind of commentary that comes with social media. I do think, though, there's a couple of things as well. There is, and there was, maybe there isn't as much anymore, but there definitely was a macho culture in men's sports, team sports, and the dressing room, locker room kind of thing. And I think this is probably a manifestation of it. The other one is, and I don't know what Vincent's views on this are, but I think females are completely underrepresented in sports media. And you've spoken there about a few of your colleagues, and I just still think that if you go to a press conference now, like 90%, 5% of the journalists there are men. The reporters, particularly the Daily Beat, is still very male dominated, and there hasn't been a wave of new young female journalists come through. There's a few of them, but there's not that many, and maybe that's because some parts of media have been impacted by, you know, high profile financial issues, I suppose, but to put it that way, in terms of the advertising revenue and so forth, and how diverse the media spectrum is now, and that there hasn't been a wave of young journalists come through, and young female journalists. And I know that, you know, the Sport Ireland Women's Sport Task Force looks at, you know, administration, coaching, refereeing, playing, but also media as 4 pillars of how you take female sport forward. And I do think we need more female analysts on it. And I do, you know, the broadcast, the TV analysts, I think, are getting better at it. And you do see more female and hear more female voices. And I think that's great. And I think it's getting better and better. But I think one of the issues here is that it's still a very, I don't know the percentage, but I would argue it's 5% of the journalist population is female. And we need to encourage more women into sport to cover male and female sport. But, you know, we need to make, you know, the environment welcoming for everybody, no matter who they are. And I think that's probably a work in progress.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the broadcast media is doing a lot better than the print media, definitely, in that sense. I mean, you've some outstanding female broadcasters in RTE, particularly. But, you know, our own website happily was voted last year as the best website for women's sport, but we don't have many women writers. We've Sinead Kazan, I suppose, is the only regular one we have, and I don't know how you get over that, because what you don't want to do is get into tokenism. You want people getting these jobs because they're good enough and they're talented enough, and I think it's something we need to be very careful of with women's sport as well. I think sometimes we big up women's sport that probably doesn't merit it, and other times we don't do enough for a sport that does merit it. I thought, for example, the women's football final, the Camogie final, I thought they were both compelling. They were so hugely competitive and intense, and it was a joy to watch them. I watched the women's FAI Cup final, and I thought the standard was very, very ordinary. And I think we've got to be very careful that we don't big up something that can't really live up to that billing.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I think there's an element of positive discrimination as well, in terms of trying to get the standards of women's sport. There are some women's sports that are relatively new, and there's some that their standards are improving, but they're not quite where they need to be. And then there's other, as you say, the ladies' football final, for argument's sake, was compelling, and there are other, hockey and other sports too. So I think though it's one of those ones where maybe in this period now of trying to push the women in sport agenda so that more girls get involved in sport, more sponsors get attracted to women's sport, that there is an element of trying to over compensate. I suppose what I found refreshing was, I don't know if you saw this or not, but Valerie Mulcahy after the women's final was pretty critical of some of the performances, and I kind of thought, that's great. You've got someone there who's calling it as it is. We don't have this tokenism of every game's not great. All games aren't brilliant. Every game, there's a lot of sports are work in progress because there's not the depth potentially of the numbers playing to give you the really high quality at the top level. But it's a work in progress, and I think we need to be careful that it's not seen as we can't say everything's great because everything isn't great. But I do think that we do need to maybe positively discriminate for a few years while those numbers increase and while the standards are improving as well. But I think the big crux of it is going to be the diversity agenda that's at every board room in the country and all over the world at the moment, that commercial sponsors will have to get behind women's sport, and that, I think, money coming into women's sport, I think, will be a big game changer over the next 5 to 10 years.
Moving on, guys, Vincent, one piece you picked out as well is on Katie Taylor, a piece by Mark Gallagher, what Katie does next. Essentially, the kind of subhead is, as opponents line up, Taylor's ambition now lies in building her legacy. So talk us through this. Essentially, it is just about Katie Taylor and the power she has in the fight game at the moment.
Yeah, well, I suppose as one of those who was in Rio, Neil, and looking back at that experience for Katie, I think most of us would have thought the best thing she could have done was get out of the ring for good. And to see what she's done with her career since, and to see that she, for her rematch with Persoon there last year, she's reckoned to have earned $1.5 million, which is an extraordinary figure, and it puts her right up there now with the highest earning female athletes in sport. And I just think, we kind of almost take Katie Taylor for granted because she has been so good for so long, and she stockpiled amateur world titles, European titles, and then she got to that moment in London where she won the Olympic gold. And women's boxing was only in the Olympics because of Katie Taylor. And for her, the pressure that was on her to win that gold, and then that moment 4 years later when she's beaten by a boxer she'd beaten so many times, and she's in tears, and the issues with her family life and everything, to pick herself up the way she did and to show the independence of mind and to go to America and work under Ross Enemy. And she's now 17-0 in her professional career, and she is the one that they're all looking up to. I think it's one of the most inspiring stories in Irish sport that we've ever seen. Yes, you can talk about the depth of talent in women's boxing, which most of us aren't sure about, but I think just the defiance that she's shown, and through all of the knockbacks that she's had, the dignity that has never left her, I think it's a great story. And Mark Gallagher writes this piece, and it's basically in the context of the fight against Amanda Serrano that has been talked about for ages, and the little edge between the Serrano family, if you like, and the Taylor camp, which goes back to a fight in Madison Square Garden when basically Katie beat Serrano's sister Cindy and beat her very comprehensively. And Serrano's trainer came over to the Taylor corner and basically said the other sister will avenge this. And so there's a little edge to that. But whether that fight will ever happen or not is hard to know, because everyone else wants to fight Katie Taylor now, because she's the one that gets pay-per-view numbers on television, and she's the one that you will get a good payday against. I just think it's a great story, and again, we just take Katie so much for granted. But when you put it in the context of 4 years ago in Rio, it's some story of redemption.
Yeah, it is incredible because, as you said, 4 years ago there was talk that she was going to go pro after it and stuff like that. But there was probably a lingering doubt amongst a lot of people of, was she going to be as good? Was she going to take to the pro ranks as well as she was in the amateur game? Was she going a little bit late beyond her prime? And I think, as Mark points out here in the middle of the piece, there's an argument that her most two recent performances, which brought her up to 17-0, have been her best as a professional, and she is looking her best as a professional even now at the age of 35, Mick.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this actually. And I think a few things jumped out at me. Yeah, I agree with that in terms of she's in phenomenal shape. And, she has, I don't know how longer she has to go competing at that level, and particularly as boxing gets more competitive and female boxing gets competitive. But her durability and to bounce back from what she bounced back from as the poster girl for Irish women's sport, but also the poster girl for women's boxing globally. What I found really interesting in this as well was, I wouldn't have thought that her earning power was as big as it was, and I'm delighted that it is. But she's now, I think she earned 1.5 million from the Pursoon fight. Some of that was linked to pay-per-view, so almost like the McGregor situation, where the more people watch, the more they get paid. So there's people are interested in her, and people are interested in women's boxing. And she's earning on the back of that, and I think that's fabulous, and hopefully that she can keep that going for the next couple of years. I do find it interesting. I know Vincent said that everyone wants to fight her, and there's a bit of that, but it's like everyone doesn't want to fight her. So there's
everyone wants to be seen to be wanting to fight her.
Yeah. Sorry, that's probably a better way of putting it. When it comes to actually, I think it's a bit of a career ender for most of them. So hopefully she's another few years in it. But one thing I thought was really interesting, and Vincent touched on it as well, was you look at boxing now at the moment and all the kind of murkiness around it, and the Kinnan situation, which have been well documented, and you look at how she's handled herself and what she has done for women's boxing, and she hasn't put a foot wrong, and she's done it with such grace and poise that in a sport where let's be honest, I think it's been a pretty horrendous couple of years for boxing, when you have all this stuff going around the outside of it, and for her to kind of sail through, that's one way she's going to keep her legacy is going to be within the ring, but also I think how she handles herself outside the ring too. I think she's just fabulous, and we're lucky to have her.
Yeah, here. Next piece we might go to, guys. It was a couple of hurling pieces you mentioned. One in the Sunday Times here. Dennis Walsh speaking about Dublin hurling. Counterculture is the headline. Dublin hurlers have the physical resources to match the footballers. It's in the mind games they seem to fall so short. So this is Dennis Walsh writing essentially about pretty much why aren't the Dublin hurlers as good or as successful as the Dublin footballers are.
Yeah,
I mean, sorry, Mick, go ahead.
No, you go first, Vincent. Sorry. we're not in studio where we can box each other. You go first.
Well, I think it's an interesting piece, because the debate about money seems to attach itself forever to the Dublin football success at the moment. And the obvious question to ask when it's brought up is, well, why haven't the hurlers had the same amount of success? And this is, Dennis points out that the hurlers, they trounced Kilkenny in the league final in 2011, their first title in 72 years. And he interviews a number of players like Ryan O'Dwyer and John McCaffrey, and they seem to be of the view that everything that was put in place for the footballers over the last 6-7 years has been put in place for the hurlers, but that a culture that probably came in with Pat Gilroy has been in place with the footballers that the hurlers have never managed to replicate. And I don't know if that's down to the fact that Dennis points out that over the last 12 years, Dublin have been coached by an outsider in hurling for 11 of those years. So I don't know if that's a factor, but the truth is that the support structures are definitely there for the hurlers, but there is the age-old thing of so many talented dual players, and you take the Conor Callaghans, the Kieran Kilkennys, the Cormac Costellos, the Eric Lowndes, they would all be massive additions to the Dublin hurling team. But obviously, you're hit with a choice, and the glamour choice is football. Imagine the Dublin hurling team with those 4 players in it. The momentum that they had in 2011 when they won that league title, they won a Leinster title then. And I often think that 2013, it was like a sliding doors moment when Ryan O'Dwyer was sent off quite early in their All-Ireland semi-final against Cork. Yeah. And that may have been the moment where Dublin's really outstanding chance of winning an All-Ireland in hurling slipped away. And as we know, Clare then beat Cork in a replay to win the All-Ireland. But that was a moment where Dublin were good enough to win the All-Ireland. But what Dennis points out is that at the time they won that league final in 2011, the footballers looked like they were in trouble. I think they lose the league final to Cork that year, and just lost a big lead. And there was this impression of flakiness in the Dublin footballers. And then what we know in hindsight is they went on to win that year's All-Ireland and pretty much haven't looked back since. But this debate is not going to go away anytime soon. But it does. This does highlight that really you can throw all the money you like at a sport, but it's what the culture is within that dressing room that becomes the key. And I think this is what's borne out by the players he talks to, that everything they wanted was given to those Dublin hurlers, and yet they haven't had the success.
Yeah, Mick, we're going to, I imagine over the next few years as well, we're going to be having this Dublin debate time and time again, but it just puts its finger on that you can have everything, but that one little missing piece, that dressing room culture, that culture of winning and being the best and setting standards, is an enormous part of it all, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose when you talk about the Dublin issue or the Dublin problem, I think it's singularly a football issue, and potentially ladies football too, actually, for that matter, where I think the difference, as Vincent said in the article, points to at a high level is culture. Talent is also, there's an abundance of talent now on the football side, and there's a traditional football, I suppose, that there just isn't in Dublin just yet, even though there are pockets of hurling and brilliant hurling people in Dublin, and there is a tradition of hurling in Dublin. It's not quite the same. And I felt in that kind of noughties period when Dublin were, shadow boxing on, close enough but not quite there, hurling was coming strong in Dublin, and Dublin overly discriminated towards hurling, where it's 1 week on, 1 week off. Like, it's not like a single sport county by any stretch. And I do feel that, at the end of that, when all the benefits that came with Dublin being resourced and sponsorship and all that kind of stuff, the hurlers got exactly the same, or more or less exactly the same. And things like travel to training, Croke Park, Dublin base, all the bells and whistles that, gets thrown at the Dublin footballers, the Dublin hurlers have kind of had the same thing for the last 10 years as well. And even the guys here, there would have been a bit of whinging from, hurling people in the past, and rightfully so, that the footballers were more sacred cows. But I think that's changed. And I think there's been a huge push on hurling in Dublin. And I think the likes of Coola and Ballyboden and Kilmacud and all these other clubs who've come really strong, particularly Coola, winning back-to-back club titles, which is an incredible achievement. But some of them were footballers in that team as well, so that's another matter. I think they're right. I'm surprised, because back in 2010, 2011, there was people in Dublin talking about, we'll win a hurling All-Ireland quicker than a football one. That was actually one of the things that was doing the rounds in Dublin GA circles. The footballers were just never going to get there. You look back at that 10 years on, and you kind of look at where the two of them are. The question is, can they both get there? I suppose looking at this from someone who's involved in underage now with the kids and that, the numbers are just so enormous in Dublin that you would like to think that at some stage that will come through in hurling. But the people need to see, or there needs to be success And there hasn't been success over the last 5 years, if we're going to be honest about it. And that success builds, gets kids involved, gets fellas to choose hurling over football, and gets people behind the hurling team. And I think Dublin hurling is at a bit of a crossroads again. And they do need, if you looked at the ranking and the pecking order, they're probably 8th out of the 10 or 9th, depending on what way you slice and dice it. So they're a good bit off and have been a good bit off. You'd like to think that they could get their act together and get back. But it is one thing that, you look back now, and that sliding doors moment, as you say, 2011 Dublin go on to win in All-Ireland, and then they have never looked back. Whereas the hurling side of things since 2013, I think it's stumbled along, and they haven't really made the progress that I think a lot of people would have hoped and expected for.
Yeah, some of the quotes... Go ahead, Vincent.
I think actually the numbers thing can be a drawback sometimes, Neil. My son hurls with Chemical Crokes, and they've such vast numbers there that actually trying to get everyone a game sometimes is the biggest problem. I remember having this conversation when I was doing Henry Shefflin's book, and I was asking him that around the age of Fela age, how many under 14s would they have? And in Ballyhale, now you think of the powerhouse that Ballyhale is. And he said, well, we probably wouldn't have 15 under 14s. So we'd fill the team with under 13s and under 12s. But the point about it is all of those players were only going to play hurling. Mm. Like from my own son's experience, like he would have played with Ronan Hayes and Fergal Whiteley, who are now on the Dublin team. But he would also have played with some really exceptionally talented young players who were also exceptionally talented at Gaelic football, rugby, in one case, a Leinster hockey interpro. So they had all of these other strings being pulled as well. And I think sometimes the numbers issue kind of blurs the problem. That what we have is huge talent base in terms of Dublin hurling, but a vast amount of those young, talented hurlers are playing 2 or 3 other sports as well, which doesn't happen in a county like Kilkenny.
No, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think, look, there's a load of things here. The Dublin thing is a very complex conversation because, there's more people playing hurling and football, and that's fantastic. And that obviously, the demographics then causes issues then when you're such a big population base. But I agree with Vincent in that, if you're from Tip and you're good at hurling, you're probably going to focus on hurling from an early age, 13, 14, or your Kilkenny or parts of Cork and whatever. You might play other sports, but they tend to be your other sport, right? In that you'll play them when the season's not on. What you have in Dublin is, and this is another thing, GAA's gone quite middle class, and kids are playing schools rugby, they're playing GAA, they're playing hurling, they're playing a bit of soccer, they're playing everything. And really talented 13, 14-year-old hurlers who, if they just focused on hurling and maybe treated the other sports as recreation rather than elite, if you get me. So not trying to play Division A hurling and Division A football and trying to play Senior Cup and trying to play, the DDSL soccer at the same time, which a lot of these talented kids are, they end up kind of getting torn in 3 or 4 different places. And the same kid at 14 in Tip is probably focusing on hurling morning, noon and night. And the standards then, you can see when it gets to later on, they're getting better, I suppose. And even though there's so much more numbers in Dublin, they're probably been sliced and diced so many different ways with all the different sports that they're not focusing enough on the one sport. And of all sports that you need to focus on to really master, it's hurling. And I think that's one of the issues. And whether people and clubs decide in Dublin that, at 15 you pick your sport and you play the other ones for fun, maybe that's one way of doing it. But then, you get into that whole thing of making kids choose one sport over another, and, maybe that's not healthy either.
There's, I thought some of the quotes from Ryan O'Dwyer in this piece were actually quite interesting. So just to touch on a few of them, he's saying, according to O'Dwyer, who joined the panel in 2011, the hurlers lacked none of the necessary supports for high performance. Everything from training camps abroad to gear and gyms and grub, all of the things money could buy were provided. And then he kind of says Dublin hurling wasn't used to success. So after they won that Leinster title in 2013 or that league in 2011, when a bit of success came that went to our heads a little bit, complacency set in. There were lads who probably didn't feel threatened for their place and were just taking things for granted. There were an awful lot of lads who would train away in November, December and January and then drop themselves off the panel. Work was getting in the way or they couldn't commit. Instead of organising their lives around hurling, they were trying to organise hurling to suit their lives. There was a softness there. That all comes from culture. Players didn't hold each other accountable. They were nearly too friendly with each other and afraid to hurt each other's feelings. Whereas with the footballers, no complacency was allowed. So there's a couple of things I took from that. First of all, it probably just underlines the frightening levels of commitment players need to have, where, you know, he's saying one of the reasons they weren't successful was because players weren't organising their entire lives around their sport, which is, you know, I think probably a lot of people would say it's maybe an unhealthy mindset to have, that's the level of commitment you have to have. But equally, he is saying that was probably the level of commitment that the footballers had around that time, and it's what the successful teams do have.
Yeah, and I do think one of the, you know, he refers to that softness there. I think they had a very specific type of manager as well in Anthony Daly, an arm around the shoulder, a great man manager, a man with the scale of personality to bring something to another level. And when Anthony reached the point where he had brought them as far as he could, I think the problem was they brought in a very different personality then. They brought in Ger Cunningham, who's an outstanding hurling coach, but wouldn't have the same maybe man management skills that Anthony had. And I think when Ryan O'Dwyer refers to that softness, I think if you look at how the hurlers essentially threw Ger Cunningham under the bus, that's the kind of softness that's communicated there. It was too easy to make the excuse that the change of manager was the problem. And I think the problem was that the culture wasn't there that is there in the football. And I happen to agree with you, Neil, by the way. I'm not sure how healthy that obsessive culture is and how much people will look back on it in 10 years' time and say, I regret, you know, just sacrificing so much of my young years to be part of this. But that's an argument for another day. I think the hurlers, you know, and John McCaffrey, pretty much on the same wavelength as Ryan O'Dwyer in this piece. It's more or less saying we need to look in the mirror at ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we had everything in place. We even had the county boards deal with Mitsubishi, for example. Same number of sponsored cars had to go to the hurlers as the footballers. So this thing about everything being put in place, it only works as an argument up to a point. At that point, players actually have to decide how much they want this.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I find really interesting about this is there's no woe is me, we're not treated the same argument here at all. In fact, it's the complete opposite. And I think, you know, one of the quotes here is, we're getting a bit embarrassed piggybacking on the footballers, getting things we shouldn't be getting or deserve, cars and suits and all that crack. You should be winning All-Irelands before you get offered those things. And I think, you know, this could be a kind of a moment, I suppose, it's obviously there's a lot of navel gazing and thinking going on in hurling circles in Dublin. You know, the tradition has been high profile outside manager. The tradition has been, happy enough to, I suppose, to with their lot. But I do think that there is talent there in Dublin, and I do think that at this stage there's a bit of stepping back going, do you know what, sec fellas, if we want to be up there on the pedestal and we want to be, you know, treated the same, well then we need to get our act together. And you'd like to think that perhaps this is a kind of a moment in time. There seems to be, it's a bit of a rallying cry, I think, from Johnny McCaffrey as well at the very end, where he talks about, at the end of the day, it's the hurling side that needs to get their act together. Is that a resource issue? No. And for the footballers, is the money that makes a difference to them? No, it's not. So, you know, I think there's a bit of, you know, we need to get our culture right. We need to get our team right. And we need to look after ourselves and not looking outside and looking at other people.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's something we're going to be speaking a lot more about over the months and years to come as well. Guys, we're running out of time. One last piece I do want to bring up as well is Sunday Independent, page 6 of their sports supplement. Neil Francis writing what's actually a really, really lovely, really interesting piece about the Ireland 1952 rugby tour to Argentina and Chile as well, which was done at the last minute. But it's absolutely a fascinating story, culminating with essentially a very young Che Guevara coming on at scrum half to take on Ireland in a test match against Argentina.
Yeah, it's a lovely piece, Neil. It's a piece, actually, when I started reading it, I thought it was going to be about a man called Paul Traynor, who was one of the Irish players who went on that tour. And Neil Francis mentions meeting his son John, and you're thinking, well, this is going to be the story of Paul Traynor, who never got his caps for playing on that tour. Well, he only played the first test. He was dropped for the second test and went off for 12 days to Patagonia, mountaineering and skiing, I think.
No, that was different. That was a Patrick Lawler.
That was Patrick Lawler.
So he played in the first test, got dropped for the second test. And
you're right. Yes, Patrick Lawler. Yeah.
Well, F that. I'm off. There were 12 days to go before the end of the tour, and Lawler went walkabout, mountaineering and hiking in Patagonia. Nobody saw him for 12 days. He turned up an hour before the squad were due to fly home from Buenos Aires. Imagine Johnny Sexton doing that now. On the Lions tour.
Well, I think what it brings it home is the Test series. They were given a checklist. The players were given a checklist, and the first one was don't forget your passport. Point 3, please bring your own shaving and washing utensils, pajamas, slippers, and a pullover. Point 5, as golf balls are hard to obtain in Argentina, you are advised to bring them with you if you wish to play. This is magnificent stuff, but it's a reminder of what rugby used to be like. It took them 6 days to get to Argentina, and their arrival just happened to coincide with the death of Eva Perón. And so Argentina went into virtually 2 weeks of mourning, state mourning, and she lay in state for 10 days. And I think 65,000 people a day filed past her coffin. And it was just a perfect storm of terrible timing, I think, for that group to arrive there in 1952.
And even
there's loads in this, Neil. It's like he talks about getting there. It was like an Indiana Jones movie. Dublin to London, London to Paris, Lisbon to Dakar, Senegal, Natal, Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and it just strikes a complete and utter chaos. Like they didn't know where they were going half the time. There's loads of subplots in this. Like you could spend all day talking about it, about the Ulster players and would they play and some wouldn't travel, and the Eva Perón thing, and then you've Che Guevara coming on as a sub and playing against, and it's just a very interesting. It's not a real kind of boys on tour kind of old story either. It's really interesting, and at a time when most feature writers used up everything in their locker last year when there was no sport on, there's still stuff out there to write about. It's a really nice piece if you get a chance. There's the Mario Rosenstock one is a bit of fun as well. And there's good stuff in the Mail too on rugby transfers. A very different era now. Obviously looking at the science of rugby transfers too in the Mail, I think it is. But that piece from Neil Francis it's a good long read, but actually you kind of fly through it because it's a bit of crack and it's well put together, I have to say.
Yeah, and just quickly, that one in the Mail as well, I'll mention as well, by Rory Keane, January sales as contract negotiations begin. Ireland can't allow quality locks to be sold off ahead of the 2023 World Cup, and he's essentially talking about how now we are finally into January. It is now finally contract season in rugby because they've had to be put on hold up until now. But essentially how Ireland have to start prioritising the second rows because it's the trending position for big money in rugby. I think it was the Sportif, the agency, released their kind of their breakdown of salary averages across the various leagues. So in the Premiership, the highest earning position was out half. Then below that were the second rows and outside centre. In the Pro 14, it was the second rows who were the highest earners, while tight head prop is still right up there as the second highest earner. Out half was next. And then in the top 14 in France, out half again was first. Second rows again coming up higher. And interestingly as well, in each of those, like hooker is a position that you don't really want to be playing, I think, if you want to be having a very successful and financially rewarding career. They're bottom of the table in the top 14 and the Guinness Pro 14 as well, and second from bottom in the Premiership as well. Just interesting to see the breakdown even of where the money is going in the positions.
Yeah, well, I think if you want to be born nowadays, if you're born 6'8", 6'9", you're probably a more precious commodity because there's not too many of them floating around. So
I think you're doing well in general life if you're born 6'8". There's plenty of opportunities you're getting.
I think if you're looking at the science of this, I think you're probably better off in enormous and being able to play in specialist positions. It seems to be that's how they're looking at people. It's a bit like trading piece of meat somewhat, like where they're looking at size and shape, and you look at the fellas who they're looking, there might be surplus to requirements. And he mentioned CJ Stander, which would be absolutely incredible considering his performances. But you look at Irish physique even, and the 6'1", 6'2" back row. We seem to be producing buckets of those kind of players, but second rows seem to be quite low in supply. So I suppose it's supply, it's an economics like everything else, isn't it?
Certainly is. And
I think the whole debate about the renewal of contracts is going to be very interesting, given the losses of through COVID. And in Rory's piece here, he mentioned some big names that are out of contract in June are Cian Healy, Tyke Furlong, Ian Henderson, Peter O'Mahony, CJ Stander, Johnny Sexton and Keith Earls. And a lot of them will be wondering what plans David Nucifora and the union have for them, because I think there'll be a much more calculated approach by the union to contracts this year, maybe than ever before, given the unique circumstances we're in.
Yeah, and certainly as well, even on top of that, then you have a whole host of maybe young guys, academy guys coming through who are leaving the academy system on the verge of their first professional deals, and how much are Irish teams going to be able to offer them, Ben Healy being one of them, who we've spoken about loads in the last couple of weeks and months. Guys, that's pretty much all we have time for. If there was one other piece you just wanted to quickly mention and throw people's attention towards, is there anything?
Brian Cody in the Sunday Times.
Yeah.
How long does he? Is he the manager to Kenny forever? He's staying one more year anyway, and that succession will be interesting. I think that's worth a read too by Dennis Walsh. There's loads of good stuff.
It's another Dennis Walsh piece, and it's an extraordinary debate that's been going on in Kilkenny for the last couple of years. Actually, in the Independent, we did a roadshow down in Kilkenny in 2018 before they played. 2019 before they played their All-Ireland quarter-final against Cork, and I was asked from the floor, is it time for Cody to go? And I found it an extraordinary question, because they'd just won the league, and then they got to the All-Ireland final last year, and they won their first Leinster last year in 5 years. But this debate is ongoing because they've been so spoiled. They've won 11 All-Irelands under this man. And I think there's a sense that they should be winning at least every second year. And right now, he is happy to continue. Nobody is willing to take him on, but the whispers are going.
Yeah, I think his greatest legacy might be, Vincent, that he hands over the team and the process and in good shape. And I think he will. I don't think this is a boom or bust scenario in Kilkenny. When he goes, the whole thing will fall apart. You'd like to think that someone will come in, and whether that's a Shefflin or somebody else, who knows, and when is, I think he'll be one that'll be allowed to make that decision himself, I'd imagine. But his record speaks for itself. Hurling is so competitive at the moment as well. It's hard to think you could win it every second year anyway, but you've got the Limericks and the Galways and stuff of this world as well. So, but I think he'll be the man who'll decide that. I don't think it'll be me anyway.
Certainly will be. Vincent Hogan and Mick O'Keefe, thanks a million for joining us this morning, and a very happy New Year to you both.
Thank you.
Same to you, Neil.
Take care.
See you, Mick.